Hi, I'm Barbara Grant. I am a neurodiverse couples and individual coach working in the field, trying to help people further their, relationships and heal themselves neurologically, relationally, spiritually. And I'm here today with Jana Smith. I'm going to let Jana introduce herself.
Thanks, Barbara. So I'm Jana, and I am a resilience coach. I help people learn to rewire their nervous system and come out of dysregulation so that they can build more resilience, access joy and calm in their lives. And this can apply to neurodiverse relationships, to chronic illness, and to trauma responses that show up when we've been conditioned from our experiences. So
Excellent. Well, Jana and I met at church, and we have been rejoicing over the fact that God had the blessing of putting us together. We live in the same town, and we have found that so much of the coaching work we do overlaps, and we are learning from each other all the time and sharing resources and even referring clients back and forth as is needed. So one of the things we've had an ongoing conversation about is what is called rejection sensitive dysphoria. And RSD is known and thought to be something that's very prevalent with ADHD people, autistic people, or ADHD, or different people who are presenting in a neurologically different way. And that's kind of where the writing dialogue school of thought has been floating around. I don't know that RSD was ever really a phrase that was coined prior to neurodiversity becoming more studied phenomenon and more people presenting as neurodivergent. So we've been talking about RSD, and given the tools and the approach and the clients we see, this comes up often. And we ourselves have experienced it in our personal lives. So in talking about it with Jana, we've been knocking around some ideas about how to frame this for ourselves as coaches, and also to begin to develop some handles or interventions or, framing that we could present to clients so that they feel relief and they have a way of processing what they perceive as rejection and not being shut down and undone and devastated by it. I want to say that in the work and research I've done so far, there really is very little research, documented academic research and medical and clinical research about this. And there is a lot about anxiety. There's a lot about PTSD and trauma. And there's a lot about, attachment disorders, et cetera, which all kind of hover around this phenomenon of rejection sensitive dysphoria. So I wanted to say that, and some of the things we may talk about today are not necessarily addressing what people are going to only identify as rejection sensitive dysphoria. We're not even sure that it is a standalone, and a phenomenon by itself, and that it isn't related to trauma, or it isn't related to anxiety, or it isn't related to attachment issues, or it isn't related to some, experience of trauma children have had, or is neurological. So, right, Jana, talk about a little bit about how we see RSD and what we want to do or don't label things.
Sure. So one of the things that Barbara and I have talked about is how the hypersensitivity around rejection or criticism or input is not unlike other sensitivities that we often see in the neurodiverse world, such as sensitivity to light or sensitivity to sound. And the way that the brain works is once it's identified something as perceived threat, then the brain wants to do a lot of external control of the environment to create a sense of safety. So we want to ask people not to wear perfume, or we want to not use certain cleaning products, or we want the lights not too bright or flashing, or we want people to not use these words with us, or we want them not to give us criticism, or not give it in this way, or only do it in writing, right? So all of these are ways that we seek to control the external environment so that we feel better or we feel safe. And the reality is, with the brain and the way that the brain works regarding threat, is the more that we avoid something, actually we become more sensitive to it over time. And it takes less and less of an exposure to that same kind of trigger to launch a response, a fight or flight, or an emergency response from the nervous system. And so while we might need certain accommodations, and that's legitimate and valid, if we only work from the angle of controlling the variables and what we're exposed to, we will find that we become more sensitive over time and more fearful about being exposed to those triggers over time. And we don't want that, because that is essentially giving away our power toward variables outside of us that we don't have control over. So instead, it can be more beneficial to empower us internally to gain back our control over what's happening by working on the inside and working to support our nervous system. Because as we build skills to learn how to self-regulate and self-soothe, we find that we actually can expand our window of tolerance and handle more of those triggers. It doesn't mean we will always like them or that we can handle them without any limits, but we will instead build our ability to engage with them and be more prepared for those times when they're going to come across our path, because we can't control everything. And that just gives us more of that empowered sense of it's not controlling me, but I can regulate me, and then I'm better able to interact with everything outside of me. So those same concepts that apply to working on building our ability to handle a smell or handle a light or a sound can also apply. Those same tools we can use when we're dealing with any kind of rejection sensitivity, anxiety around social interactions, and fear of not being good enough.
That's right. So something, I'm loving what you're saying, by the way. And I have to tell you, even though Jana and I have talked about this, I always learn something new when she opens her mouth and talks about more stuff. So everything you just said, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's so true. That's wonderful to know. So something I want to add to this right now is that, there definitely is a difference about being rejected with somebody not smiling at you, or not inviting you to sit with them at lunch, or looking at you a little longer like, that was weird. Maybe you're thinking, oh, I'm being rejected. Your perception of rejection, okay, versus somebody coming at you with overt abuse and overt verbal attack, accusation, shame, physical attack, monetary attack, spiritual attack. I want to very much distinguish that when somebody's abusive, overtly so, that, or even covert abuse that is happening, maybe other people can't see it, that what you're experiencing is rejection and you're being traumatized. Okay. But that's not this dysphoric concept that we're talking about. Dysphoria is more the perception of more rejection that's coming at you than maybe really is. Okay. And I've heard this from many clients. Maybe the neurodivergent husband will say, oh, she rolls her eyes and I just want to die. I just want to die. So what do you want to say about that, Jana, the perception versus the actual truth of being traumatized?
Definitely. I kind of think there's three categories. So there's mistreatment. That's not okay. We don't want to participate in that. We want to set boundaries with that. And then we've had mistreatment, so we're hypersensitive to things, and we're sometimes perceiving things as mistreatment that are neutral and benign and aren't mistreating us. And that's where we can get in real confusion of starting to doubt ourselves, and is it or isn't it abuse and all of that. Right. So that's a confusing place where we might need input and some outside help to untangle that. And that kind of overreactivity, we need to create safety and some boundaries so that we can begin to work with, then if there's overreactivity happening, that's happening for a reason and from the history. So right. We don't want to tell our brain, oh, you're just, you need to settle down. You're just making a big deal out of this, because we want to listen. We're wired to react to things that aren't okay. And then the third category would be, there isn't anything threatening, but our brain sees it as a threat. And sometimes we can get to that category when we've been in the other two and we haven't gotten help and we don't have what we need for a long enough time, that our brain just says everything's unsafe. And every time that person opens their mouth, it's threatening, whether they're saying, can you take out the trash, or what do you want for dinner, right? And once we get to that level of reactivity, we really need, Barbara, what you talk about with the grace and space. We need some safe place away from the constant input and interaction that's triggering us, so that we can settle our system down and begin to tell the difference. But whether or not there's been, that progression, all of us have the ability to take something the wrong way, misunderstand what somebody intended, and be hurt by something. And we can legitimately be hurt even if they didn't mean it that way. Our emotional experience is still real. And if it wasn't intended to be unkind and there's nothing wrong with what they're doing, that's where we can work with our own system to begin to say, hey, it's okay, the soothing and the comforting tools that will help our system to settle down and build the ability to interact in those types of situations without reacting to them.
Yes. Excellent input. And I love it that you're making these distinguishing categories of, mistreatment, and then chronic mistreatment leads to hypersensitivity of the threat of mistreatment versus perceived rejection that can come from a lot of different places, including compounded stress or latent trauma unresolved from childhood, coupled with a neurodiverse, brain wiring. And even the word dysphoria, by the way, when I've looked it up, and I'm looking at it right now, it's a state of feeling very unhappy, uneasy, or dissatisfied. So, that's pretty general, that word dysphoria. And disassociation or dissociation is a little bit more clinical in that it is sort of like a disconnected state of not really in your body, not really in reality, going somewhere else. So I'm even wondering where this dysphoria wording, like rejection sensitive dysphoria, like pretty much everyone on the planet is wired to be sensitive to rejection.
Yeah.
Because we're attachment seeking, relational seeking, safety seeking beings. So we want to say again that this term is evolutionary. I think the understanding of it, the application of it, and the symptomology even that's attached to it. Because there are some people that describe a literally visceral, painful inner, such a terror and pain on their insides that it is palpable. It's not just unease. It's like, I'm in agony. I'm just devastated by this. Versus, yeah, that wasn't cool what she said, but oh well, so it's not the same. But for the purposes of being helpful and practical, as both Janet and I are committed to being as coaches, we were talking, you and I, Jana, about how, framing things and the context of things, how the way through this, and not controlling the externals, but seeking internal resolution, internal regulation. That happens in many different ways with different ends to that. And, a lot of what past therapy has been built around either cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy. These are even internal family systems, with both Jana and I are familiar with, is about mental constructs, right? Narratives and mental metacognitive processes where you're thinking about what you're thinking about and noticing the relationship between your perception, your thoughts about that, and what is happening in terms of what you're being triggered by, and how you respond physiologically or behaviorally to that trigger, right? So that's one approach that can actually be effective at helping people break down their perception and noticing when they're overreacting maybe to what the true input trigger was, or where the opportunity is. It this person is verbally assaulting me and they need to stop, or you need to physically leave the room, or they just tired, they rolled their eyes, and you're having a heightened response that maybe is on your side of the equation of taking responsibility for. Is that right? Yeah. So you want to talk more about the mental framing, and then we can, as we talk through this, we're definitely going to get into the somatic approach as well.
Sure. Yeah, great description. So In terms of reframing, when we find ourselves in a situation where we're feeling that internal angst or that, pit of your stomach, I'm, feeling terrible after this interaction. Some of it goes back to those attachment injuries that we're afraid. And then the fear that's driving it is that I'm going to be alone. I'm going to be in a bigger way rejected, that I'm not good enough. And if we see those kinds of narratives showing up in our mental processing after the emotions, right? Because the first thing that usually comes up is feeling really hurt or really angry. And then behind that is, I'm scared of what might come of this. Are they going to not want me? Am I going to be left out or alone? Right. And those are some really core human fears that we all have. And it can show up more if we've had trauma or if we have a neurodivergent brain. But when we start recognizing what those narratives are, what are we actually afraid of, we can begin to move into the processing prefrontal cortex of our brain and say, okay, am I actually in danger? Is that really true? It might feel true right in this moment, but if we step back and look on a more global scale, that's probably not true. And the next question is it life-threatening? Because if your response system, your emergency response system just got activated, the brain doesn't distinguish between the house is on fire and I'm afraid I'm going to be alone and this person just criticized me. So all the same neurochemistry is going to be released. And in order to work with your system and empower yourself to be able to soothe and calm, you want to recognize the brain is now acting like my life is in danger. And even if we aren't sure if part of it's true, like maybe I will be rejected or maybe I will be alone, we can speak to and reframe the part of our brain that says, I'm in grave danger, because we actually aren't. We're going to be alive and standing here in 10 minutes, regardless of how this conversation went. And so, we want to reassure our brain we're not in the kind of danger as the chemistry that has been released is trying to say that we are. And so there are a couple of ways that we can help reinforce that to our system. So we can do some of that mental work, like you mentioned, Barbara, with IFS. We can say what part is having this narrative or what part is worried, or we can do some reframing by saying, okay, what alternative narrative is true? And then I'm going to declare that. But sometimes when we're especially triggered, we can't even quite get to that mental processing yet because the brain has been hijacked by the emergency alarm and it's just saying, run out of the house or fight back. And so that's where having some more somatic and body-based tools can help us even get to that thinking and processing step. And that's where, whether it's a breathing exercise or another body-based exercise, that's where we can actually bypass the emergency response system and bypass the thinking part of the brain and just speak safety back to our whole system. Right. So that's the goal of those kinds of exercises.
Yeah, I think that's so important, the distinction you're making, because, we do have some pretty physiological, mechanical, biological switches we can throw, circuit breakers. That's what I wanted to say. Circuit breakers that are like, whoa, overload. And something I learned, for instance, when I was learning about deep breathing exercises, that whenever we breathe regularly and deeply, that the chest muscles are sending a physiological signal to the brain, like, we're good, everything's fine. And no matter what you're thinking, or even in your limbic system is going, red alert, the chest muscles are like, no, we're good down here. All's good in the engine room, Captain Kirk,
Yeah. And what's neat about that is, when we have that danger response, it's like somebody just pulled the fire alarm at school, right? And when it gets pulled, you don't know, is it a drill or is it real, or is somebody messing around, or did the administration plan this? You don't know when an alarm first goes off, where it came from. And we don't always have the ability to know where it came from. But the reality is the alarm may or may not be sounding off in the same measure as what the emergency is. But once the alarm's going off, we can't go, oh no, this is only a level 2. It's not a real emergency, because the whole cascade of neurochemistry is already gone. It's already released into your system and it has to work its way through. It has a half-life. So you can't just flip unlike somebody can go to the school alarm and say, time to be done, and you turn it off. But we still have our heart racing, or, so the trigger can stop. You can end the conversation or turn the lights off or leave the room from a smell. but the internal chemistry still is going to ride out in its own time. And that takes time. It doesn't just shut off. But we can do exactly what you're talking about. We can act back on the brain by using our body, and the vagus nerve will send those messages back up to the brain to put the brakes on the whole alarm system and say, no, 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 it's all clear. That was a false alarm, or we're reacting more than it's not the kind of emergency that the alarm said it was. And it's very powerful because it can quickly act back on what the brain is doing. It doesn't just erase all the neurochemistry that's in our bodies, but it can very quickly soothe and calm and bring reprieve to that sense of panic, or I'm not going to be okay, or this is the most terrible thing, and now I can't handle this person or this situation ever again, right? Because those are the messages it wants to say if it thinks we're in that kind of danger. But we can ramp it down by giving it other information that's true in this moment.
Yeah, excellent. Very true. So why don't you show us, you were talking to me about an exercise you thought would be very useful and somewhat adaptable to this kind of an episode of somebody has pulled my fire alarm. I don't know what's the real issue, but I am like freaking out now. So walk us through something, and then we can move into maybe even a context of the spiritual aspect of what we're talking about here too, because there is a spiritual component of all of this. So go ahead.
Definitely. Yeah. So one exercise that I like when I think of RSD, or just that kind of that gut sense of fear of rejection or being alone or not being good enough, is called body tapping. And I like this because you can modify it and use it in a more intense way or a more calming way. So if when you feel triggered, you immediately feel really angry, you might want to modify the exercise versus if you are feeling anxious. So I'll demonstrate and then walk you through some different variations of that. So just the general way to practice body tapping is to make a fist and to just tap down your arms. You can tap your chest. You can go down your legs, which nobody can see us doing that, but we know we're doing it. And then you can also, even with flat hands, tap your neck, the back of your neck, your head. And as you're doing this, you would want to spend a little more time in each area than what I'm walking through, because I want to make sure to give you all the variations. So you would spend, 1 to 3 minutes just slowly working your way through the body. And you can also tap your face. We have so many touch and sensory receptors all over the skin, all over our body. So you can tap your feet. You can tap the bottoms of your feet. That can be really grounding. You can tap your hands and the bottoms of your ribs, your sternum. So just really lots of different places that are helpful. And then if you find that you have a lot of intense emotion, sometimes it feels really good when you're upset to tap harder. So especially I like tapping my chest, my rib cage, if I'm feeling really activated. And so you can even do this and take really big breaths, like, and just kind of discharge that frustration while you tap, and then move
like
into
gorillas, like the
yeah.
razorback.
I mean, the animals do this in the wild. There's a reason. Anything that you see babies or children or animals doing oftentimes is rooted in the way that our nervous system is wired and just innately knowing what we need, right? So whether you shake it off or whatever, all of those kinds of things that animals do can actually be really helpful. So after, if you go into an intense experience with it, do that for 20 or 30 seconds and then move into slower and calmer, because that will help discharge the emotion and release the frustration or the anger, and then invite your nervous system into a more grounded state where you just take nice deep breaths. And then, the other layer that you can add to this is you can be verbalizing. So you can start out by expressing how you feel. I feel really angry, or I feel so hurt and just gutted at what was said. So you can say that, I just feel so mad and so hurt. And how could somebody say that to me? And it's okay to just declare what feels true. We don't need to argue with it or prove whether it's right or wrong. And it doesn't matter whether they meant it or they didn't, or they're being mean or they're being nice. Just let yourself have whatever those emotions are, because if you let them out, they'll be over with, versus if you try to reason with them and stuff them down in, we're actually engaging and dragging out the process. So whether it's true or not, whatever, say what feels true. And then you can begin to follow that up with, but I'm okay. And I'm here right now, taking deep breaths, and, I can smile, and I can see the tree outside and the bird and the flower. And you begin to kind of pull yourself into your present reality, and those sensory bits and the data that you can absorb through your skin and through your eyes and through your senses helps to orient the brain to the reality of, we're breathing, we're okay right now,
Yeah.
and there's lots of other things here that are stable and safe.
Right. That's so wonderful. That's so effective. And, there are a lot of videos about tapping, and tapping has become much more documented and studied and understood as being a very effective intervention. In the last 10 years, especially while I was getting my master's in marriage and family and therapy, none of the models they talked about were somatic body exercise models. Because I think a lot of schools are training us to pass the board exams of our states, and none of the state board exams were written any sooner than 20 years ago about somatic body or neurodiversity. Like, what is that? Right. So, but a lot of students that I was in class with talked about somatic and were leaning into that and very excited about it. So that was my first exposure. And then, of course, meeting you and learning some of these interventions. So, something I want to pivot to quickly is a sense of, rejection. And you and I have talked about it in terms of the link to shame. And our Achilles heel as a species, I think, is not our sin-based nature, but the shame we feel when we don't resolve the sin that has happened. That's a choice. Grace and forgiveness and going to God is another choice. Shame and hiding. And as you were talking about RSD before, and where this, is now being described and experienced and said, yes, I have that. I was thinking of, Adam and Eve, and God was a good father. I mean, he was not a traumatic, he didn't abuse his kids, right? He was the good father. He provided everything they needed. And they had this RSD shame, go and hide, like, oh my God, God is going to reject us. Like, he's going to kill us. Like, what up? Like, I don't know what triggered it, but there was the potential within them for having that hypersensitive. The best solution to having done the wrong thing is not go tell God about it, who knows anyway, and apologize, but let's get fig leaves and hide and then blame each other for what happened. So what are your thoughts about, the spiritual aspect of feeling rejected, the lie of the enemy that tells us we are rejectable, we are not redemptive, we cannot be redeemed, there is no hope for us. What people think about us is in fact who we are, not what Jesus says about us. So what are your thoughts about that? And how can we help people lean into the truth of what God is saying about us in the Bible?
It's such an important conversation. Brene Brown did a bunch of research about guilt versus shame, and really found that when people identify in a guilty way, that's, I made a mistake, and that leads to great outcomes, behavior correction, reconciliation, and positive response in the future. It actually helps us to change and grow. When we go into shame, that's, I'm defective, I'm bad, I'm a mistake, I'm horrible. That actually perpetuates more sin, more addictions, and more dysfunctional behavior, because from a lens of shame, we don't actually have the power to make the change. And so when we're having a lot of reactivity to sensitivity and sensitivity to rejection and anxiety around what people are saying or how they think of us or perceive us, it comes back to we've got a shame pattern instead of a guilt response if we think we've messed up. And it, I think, is really tied to our identity. Because if we think generally, I'm lovable and I have something to offer and I'm going to make mistakes because I'm human, we're going to have the capacity to receive input. And when we get input, if we think, yep, that just proves how terrible I am and I need to hide it because if people really found out who I am, they would definitely reject me, then we're going to struggle to receive input productively. And I think what distinguishes between whether we can be in the guilt lane instead of the shame lane is if we have a great rooted foundation in our value in Christ and what we do have to offer. And if we've been patterned towards shame based on the way we've been parented to, responded to, spoken to, treated, it's not our fault for going there. That's naturally where we will go. So it's not like we're saying, oh, well, you need to just correct your behavior and have a guilt response instead of a shame response. If you're having a shame response, then you need help with how to repattern that so that isn't your go-to. And so for a spiritual application, it's really bathing ourselves in how God loves us. And it's not because of something we did, and no one can reject us out of that. We can't earn it. And how can we really get that to sink deep, make it feel true, and embody that and live from that place? And that's one of the most effective ways to become resilient against the whole rejection sensitivity spiral.
Yeah, I would agree. And as you were saying that, it did occur to me that, some of us, like I had a trauma experience as a child with a very critical neurodivergent mother who was PTSD and had a lot of reactivity and dysregulation and was verbally, physically shaming, abusive, controlling. And, my escape, the bubble I climbed into was creative artwork. I would just go into the space in my brain and in my heart and soul of beauty and creativity. That was, literally my happy place. Made a lot of artwork. But I think about, kids who are neurodivergent who are not attaching, even from young ages, are not attaching in the same way to people with the bonding chemistry, with the eye contact. They're more interested in systems, patterns, functions of things. They're very brilliant and intelligent. They're organizing shapes. And I mean, my son played with his Thomas the Tank Engine trains by categorizing, lining them up by size and shape and color. And then he would use them to make signs and circles and shapes like they were, he was painting with them. And they were not, they were trains. He didn't like choo-choo train with them. He was doing other things. So I think kids that are neurodivergent have a sense, they're neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. And there is a sense of, am I okay? And a tendency to fig leaf mask at a young age, because that seems to them a reasonable strategy to hide and act as if, as best as they can figure it out, that's what everybody's doing in this room, I'll do that too. Not because they intuitively know that, but they're like, I better do field work and calculate and tabulate and assess and analyze and then behave accordingly, right? But they do have a heightened unease or a dysphoric sense of, am I okay? And maybe a different kind of an attachment experience, maybe more attached to systems, patterns, friends who are parallel playing with them, who are also comfortable in those arenas, right? I'm thinking of my entire stage crew squad when I was in drama in high school, like they're the geeks, the geek squad, right? So talk about that a little, because these kids and these people, even if they're not diagnosed, maybe sensing that there is a lack of fit for them in the culture of our day and age now, that doesn't, some cultures do really admire rules and rigid cultural strategy. And some of the more traditional Japanese culture or the more formal German culture that I grew up in, there was prescribed everything, even the English culture of, how the upper class was and such, right? So that would be a place and a way of culturally fitting in that could be, oh, I get the system, I can fit in. So all that said, I think there is a greater sensitivity, or not sensitivity, but an exposure that they've had lifelong to this perception of, I don't fit in and there is something wrong with me. And because their relational circuitry, they're more transactional maybe than relational sometimes, they're not understanding God's agape love. They're transacting for maybe relational connection versus just receiving it. So what do you think about what I'm saying and how that may make rejection sensitive dysphoria a more pronounced and frequent experience that neurodivergent people are having?
Well, absolutely, 100% with everything you're saying. And I think with ADHD, it's a little bit different because it's usually not lacking the desire to connect, but sometimes impulsively trampling on those opportunities. And then, so there's still, you still get the feedback like, how come this isn't working out for me? Or why am I always messing up? So for
Right.
different reasons, I think,
Right.
the variety of neurodivergent brains can end up coming to that same sort of a conclusion of like, maybe there is a little bit of something wrong with me.
Yeah.
And so even though we can't undo our culture and we can't, work back against what's there, I think these kinds of conversations where we say there are a lot of different ways to have a brain and there are a lot of different ways to engage with the world. And, as Dr. Stephanie's research has found, even when you have two autistic partners in a marriage, oftentimes there's a higher level of satisfaction. So it's not about that there's something wrong or that they're not engaging in the right way. It's that the needs are different. And
Mhm.
it's if they're standing in front of a mirror all of the time in the culture that says you're different, so that's wrong, then it becomes a problem. And there's always the invitation to move into those skills that will help with relating and engaging in the world. So there's a lot of layers to this, but I think the important thing is no matter how your brain is wired, there are ways that you can access connection with God and your identity, and that you can access joy. And so what comes to mind first when you were talking about all of this is Jim Wilder's book that he did with another individual, The Other Half of Church, because that's written by Jim Wilder and an engineer, and they talk through how the different ways that the brain processes. And so some of us might have a little bit more leaning toward logical function, but it doesn't mean our brain isn't still having to use the emotional, connective, relational part. So we all have weaker and stronger muscles in our body. We all have more fluid functions in our brain and the ones that get hung up on the way through. But there's an invitation for any of us to grow in the areas that we would benefit by developing. And that's how I see, what you're talking about, and that the relational connection.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just like when you were saying in the very beginning, when we're super dysregulated, before we could even get into our prefrontal cortex, we have to kind of calm down.
Yeah.
And I I do believe that when we begin to get well, even in one area, all right, if we're sleeping better, if we're eating better, if we're exercising more, if we're, balancing our body chemistry with maybe ADHD meds, if we're laughing more often, if we're creating something, if we're serving, if we're in a relationship with somebody that likes us, or if we're doing something that we really like to do and we're being valued and validated in that. All of these things, these human experiences that can be very positive, help other more positive things happen in our physiological, neurological, psychological, and spiritual capacity, right? So they all work together is really kind of, we're integrated. We're not meant to be, oh, I'm only going to do body tapping and that's it. It's like, no, that's going to lead you to do other things. And, I don't think I'll ever jump out of an airplane and be a skydiver. Not going to happen. But
Me either. I'm not interested.
I
I
might
have
get
adrenaline in
something
my normal
someday.
life.
Do something different that I have never done before.
Right.
So, so this obviously is a conversation we're going to continue to have, and we're going to listen to what we said to each other and go, oh, we forgot to say this, or we didn't talk about that, or we're going to learn something new that is like, oh, now we need to talk about that.
Yes.
So what would you want to say as our closing remark from your side of the equation?
Well, I would say if you are struggling with rejection sensitivity, whether it's dysphoric or just, you struggle a little on worrying about what people think or being criticized, I see you. That's a really uncomfortable place to be. It does hurt, and we don't want you stuck there. And I also want to just encourage you that there are a lot of ways you can support yourself besides training everybody around you how to behave, because that's a never ending losing battle and they're not going to get it right all the time. So while we do want to ask to be treated kindly, I want you to know that there are things that you can do to support yourself so you don't feel as vulnerable to this.
And how could people find you? How can they engage with you? And then I'll close with what I offer and how they can find me.
Sure. The best way to find me is to go to my website, Jana, Janam as in Mary, Smith.com. And there you'll find free resources, podcasts that I've been on, and then you can learn more about what I offer, such as courses and coaching. Really, all of that designed to help you, support your nervous system and become more resilient.
Great. And I've sent a lot of people to Jana, so they're enjoying working with her very much. And to work with me, I also have a website, BG, like Barbara Grant dash HC, as in Hope for Couples. But I work with individuals, couples, even the children, the adult children of the couples that I work with. And I work with neurodivergent or neurotypical people that are in relationship and people that are just trying to grow and detoxify in how they behave and in the relational world that they're traveling in, with a lean towards understanding our primary identity in Christ and being able to leverage the love he has for us and the grace he shows us. So thank you, Jana. This has been so much fun. I've learned so much, and I can't wait for the next go around, whatever that is that we decide to talk about. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Barbara, for creating this space for this conversation. I think it's really valuable.